First Chronicles 28 continues the transition from David to Solomon, and specifically the temple building project. I have here the chapter in summary form in bullet points. David first addresses the Kahal, the assembly. David encourages Solomon to obey the law of the Lord and to serve him with a loyal heart and a willing mind. David gives detailed instructions to Solomon for the construction of the temple and its furnishings, including the vestibule, temple chambers, inner sanctuary, altar, and utensils. And remember, this is a divinely given blueprint. David assigns specific roles and responsibilities to the priests and Levites within the temple service and emphasizes the importance of their obedience to the Lord and his instructions. And then finally, David encourages the officials and people to support Solomon in building the temple and to contribute generously. And so that is the chapter in a nutshell. But as we've learned, there is always much more lurking beneath the text. So we will begin to unpack things. And we'll start here with Lightheart's commentary. He says, in the final chapters of First Chronicles, David delivers a series of speeches to the Kahal, the assembly of Israel, the officers and princes of his court and army. The Kahal consists of the princes, Sar used 6 times, and warriors, Gibarim. The speech is structured chiastically, and so here he has the rough outline and structure of this chapter, and note that it centers on Yahweh's choice of David and Solomon. Lightheart continues, the Torah frame is notable. David begins with a Deuteronomy 6-ish, hear, brethren and people, and ends with an exhortation to keep the Lord's commandments as a condition of retaining the land. So note that it is conditional. That sets the context for David's talk about temple building. A successful temple project does not depend on mere skill. It will succeed if the leaders of Israel listen and guard and seek God's commandments. And remember, these are key terms that we've come across quite a bit in Chronicles. And picking up similarly, Han in his commentary says, David's final speech to the sacral assembly, the Kahal, is a masterful summary of the chronicler's themes, focused on the temple and dynasty. Beginning with his unique address, hear me, my brethren, and my people. David's speech is cast in a familial and filial context of the covenant with which the chronicler began his work. Thus, First Chronicles ends as it begins with the tracing of the genealogy of election. And of course, we've covered much of this ground, and part of that we covered in the genealogy video. But continuing on, John Stone notes here that the ark, with which the whole section begins and ends, in verses 11 and 18, provides the appropriate focus for the fundamental meaning of the temple. So remember, the ark used to be brought out in war during the times of Moses and Joshua, right? So when they're having to take the land, it's something of a symbol of war because it kind of was symbolic of the presence of God. So the Lord went before them, things like that. But now that David has subdued the enemies, the ark will now become a symbol of peace and rest. And so Merrill is going to pick up on this theme as well. So in his commentary, he says, David describes the temple as a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of Yahweh and as a place for the footstool for his feet. This combination of similes portrays a king who sits in regal splendor on his throne and who rests his feet not on the ground, but on a splendid footstool. I've read at least one scholar who argues it's the entire temple itself that God rests his feet on, not the ark itself. I'm not sure if both views aren't intended at various points, but either way, I want to pause for a quick sidebar here. We'll hit further down mercy seat language, and I'll try to pinpoint exactly where, but in the Leviticus series that I have on my channel, where Heiser goes through the book, he has a good discussion of this in chapter 16, the Day of Atonement. Simply put, mercy seat is a very abstract translation. And Heiser goes on further to point out that it's really an enthronement scene, the Day of Atonement. He then says, if you're going to go for an abstract translation, a better one would be something like throne instead of mercy seat. But the takeaway here is when we read about the mercy seat, or even the ark more broadly, realize we're talking about regal concepts, kingly concepts. For me, at least, that's not the way I thought about that language. But note how well that ties with the New Testament. the cross, the place of atonement. It's spoken of in royal terms, where Christ is enthroned. He's high and lifted up. Of course, that obviously mirrors, again, this quote unquote mercy seat idea, the place where atonement is made, but itself is a royal type scene. But I would highly encourage you to check out at least that portion of the Leviticus section. Again, like I said, I'll put in the description the exact time marker of where that is. But we will return back to Merrill. He continues, Yahweh had said he would dwell among his people on the earth in a man-made structure as a display for his immanence. So you have this immanence, transcendence kind of idea going on here. And I've read this sentence so many times, and I don't know if I made a typo, but it says, on the other hand, Solomon would say of the temple later on that the temple, no matter how glorious, was not fitting for the transcendent God. So again, that concept that God is both immanent, he's with us, but he's also transcendent, he's so other. So he, that is Solomon, asks incredulously, but will God really dwell on earth with men? He answers his own question in a sense by exclaiming, the heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built. It's at the end of the temple project and dedication. But Isaiah echoes this when he describes his vision of Yahweh seated on the throne high and exalted, or high and lifted up. But I want to return to this point here. Think about this. But will God really dwell on earth with man? That's what Solomon asks. And of course, the answer is yes. In fact, not just with men, but as man. He takes on our weaknesses. And that's part of what makes the incarnation so dramatic and frankly so controversial, that God would condescend in such a way and not just live among men, but die in a horrible way in our place. It's still controversial even for like Muslims today, right? They won't accept that because how could God condescend so much? But that's the point. The point is that he does empathize with us because he has lived as us. Just a very interesting idea. But pushing further down in verse 2, you have this footstool of our God language. But I want to return to an earlier portion of Han's commentary in a section where he was discussing the link between David and Melchizedek in chapter 17. And here he is interacting with Psalm 2. And I would also encourage to check out the chapter 17 video for more on this kind of stuff, as well as the Psalm 2 video, because those two really hit on a lot of these themes. And it's really amazing because when you understand it properly, Psalm 2 really becomes a very powerful two powers in heaven kind of text where you have a binitarianism, God, you have the God-man kind of thing going on. And so these concepts are not foreign to the Old Testament. It's not a New Testament invention. You have divine Messiah, essentially, there in Psalm 2 if you're reading it properly. But Han's commentary on page 59, he says, however, the key biblical link between Melchizedek and the Davidic kingdom remains Psalm 110:4. There is considerable scholarly consensus that the psalm attributed to David is pre-exilic and likely one of the oldest in the Psalter. It may have originated in the liturgical context of an enthronement ceremony for a new Davidic king, possibly even the coronation of Solomon. There are important points of contact between the themes and language of the psalm and the chronicler's work, including the psalm's reference to the universal reign of Zion's king over the nations, the divine deliverance of the king from his enemies, and the apparent filial relation to the Davidic king to God, i.e. the Davidic covenant in 1 Chronicles 17. The psalm speaks of a footstool for God, a rare word in the Bible used uniquely in Chronicles and the Psalter to describe the ark. And switching gears here, you have the language of David being a man of war in verse 3. We've hit some of these themes before about how David was disqualified, and Lightheart has a bit to say about that in his commentary. Page 87, he says, though his wars were legitimate and just, they disqualify him from building a house of rest, the house where the ark rests. And Japhet makes a similar point. The sharp distinction between wartime and peacetime kingship is remarkable, especially as David's exhortations to Solomon have a military ring to them. Be courageous and act in verse 10, and be strong and courageous and act in verse 20. There is a time for war and a time for peace. There's also a king for war and a king for peace, a king who breaks and a king who builds. Though peacetime politics requires the military virtues of strength, cunning, and courage, Politics is not war carried on by other means. And continuing on, Lightheart says, David's inability to build the temple is part of a Moses typology that, as I have noted, runs through the chronicler's depiction of David. As Moses was not permitted to enter the land, so David is not able to build the temple. And Hahn makes this point, as well as I believe Johnstone. The two situations are more deeply analogous than they might appear, given that Solomon's temple completes the conquest, and given the analogies between Moses, Joshua, and David and Solomon. For example, Moses/David says, be strong and courageous to Joshua/Solomon. Moses dies with the rebels and does not enter the rest of the land. David does not enter the rest of the temple. Neither Moses nor David is cut off from Yahweh. Their personal sins are forgiven, but both are cut off from enjoying the full fruit of their labors. David dies, as it were, on the plains of Moab, on the far side of Jordan. David's exclusion from the temple building anticipates the end of 2nd Chronicles. The exile interrupts the Davidic dynasty. In the chronicler's own time, a second temple is being built, not only without David's help, but without help of any Davidic king, though Zerubbabel is descended from David. David's exclusion from building the first temple is matched by the exclusion of Davidic kings from the second temple. And this exclusion is linked, if somewhat loosely, to abuse of the land. In Chronicles, the abuse is a failure to give the land rest. Because David sheds blood, he is not allowed to build the temple. Because the Davidic kings failed to give the land rest, they are not allowed to re-enter as kings when Israel recovers the land. The analogy is closer if we incorporate kings, which emphasizes that the Davidic dynasty falls because of the shedding of innocent blood. And that's in 2 Kings 24, verse 4. And picking up in verse 4, the text reads, Yet the Lord God of Israel chose me from all my father's house to be king over Israel forever. For he chose Judah as leader, and in the house of Judah my father's house, and among my father's sons. So there's this strong election flavor to this passage. And Hahn writes, Thus when Isaiah reenacts the Davidic covenant, he renders you in the plural. The promise spoken to David is meant for Israel. I will make with you an everlasting covenant, my steadfast, sure love for David. It's Isaiah 55:3. According to the chronicler, David understood all this. The Lord God of Israel chose me to be king over Israel forever. Every king of Israel is David in some sense. That is why the prophet Ezekiel can prophesy what amounts to a second coming of David, in which the servant, David, will be established as the one shepherd and king forever, by a new everlasting covenant, in which God's sanctuary will be established forevermore among his people. And this is extremely messianic. And especially note here, if you watch the video in John's gospel, how he connects Jesus to the heavenly temple. It's an ushering in that you have this second David that's going to be the one shepherd, one king forever, ushering in a new everlasting covenant in which God's sanctuary will be established forever. Again, that ties to Jesus ascending to heaven, sending the Spirit, and the Spirit indwelling believers, which becomes the new temple because the Spirit now dwells in believers. Just so many messianic ideas floating around. But Hahn continues, given this widespread expectation of a restoration and fulfillment of the kingdom of David, it seems highly unlikely that the chronicler did not harbor similar hopes. In moving on to the end of verse 4, Lightheart is commenting on this language that God took pleasure in David. Lightheart points out that the verb is a sacrificial term for the acceptance of an offering that meets the requirements of wholeness. And so Leviticus 1:4, 7:18, 22:23, and 22:25. That sacrificial allusion furnishes a basso continuo underneath David's speech. Saul was chosen by Lot in a similar multi-layered telescoping process. Benjamin is taken, Kish's house is taken, Saul is taken. And we can hardly read about Saul's selection without thinking of Achan, who is revealed as the cause of Israel's defeat at Ai by a similar process of lot casting. I never made that connection before. That's really interesting. Saul is designated as king, and Achan is unveiled as a criminal by the same process that determines the scapegoat on the Day of Atonement. Both Saul and Achan are sacrificial, though in different ways. Saul's death is a scapegoat death that clears the land and makes way for renewal. David, too, is a choice sacrifice. But moving further on in verse 5, speaking of the language of choosing Solomon, he writes, "Thus, First Chronicles ends as it begins, with the tracing of the genealogy of election. David uses the term election 4 times, establishing the divine chain that connects Solomon to God's plan for Israel. There is a steady intensification of filial language as David reminds the people: 1, that God chose Judah; 2, that from the house of Judah he chose my father's house; 3, that from among my father's sons he chose David, from all my father's house to be king over Israel forever; and finally 4, that all of my sons he has chosen Solomon, my son, to sit upon the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel." In Lightheart similarly notes on this language that Yahweh's choice of both David and Solomon is an election to privilege. I thought this was really interesting. I don't want to veer too far into election language and Calvinism, and this is very interesting, especially since I think I'm pretty sure Lightheart is a Calvinist. It is interesting that he is noting here that the election here it's to a privilege, it's to a service. I would agree with people like Flowers that I think Calvinists, when it comes to things like Romans 9 and elsewhere, just overall election language, that they tie it synonymously with salvation in a way that I don't think Scripture does. There are elections to specific tasks. And so here, it's not as if David and Solomon are chosen to the exclusion of all other Israelites. They're chosen to be the leader, to be the king over Israel, to bless the rest of Israel, hopefully in good conduct. It's interesting because they really note this election language. All the commentators note how prominent it is, but it's election to a service. But returning back to Lightheart, he says, Solomon appears to have an even higher status, chosen to sit on the throne of the kingdom of Yahweh over Israel. As a man of peace and royal builder, Solomon is a sacrament of Yahweh's kingship in a more overt way even than David. He shares Yahweh's throne because he is chosen as Yahweh's son. And I want to return to this idea. Sonship is everywhere in the passage. David repeatedly refers to Jesse's sons and his own: among the son of my father, of all my sons, many sons, chosen my son Solomon, yours, that is David's son Solomon. And the sixth use of son in the speech, Yahweh breaks in to claim David's son as his own. I have chosen Solomon to be a son to me. Like I said, I want to return to this because this is really interesting, because this is actually picked up in the New Testament in Revelation. I believe it's 3:21 specifically, that refers to those that overcome. If we overcome, we share the throne with Jesus, just as Jesus has conquered and shares the throne with the Father. That's remarkable. If you look at this and are humbled by, I can't imagine to be Solomon, to be chosen for this task. You are chosen for this task. If you are a believer, you are granted to share the throne. I'm not sure there's a more powerful verse in the entire Bible. But Lightheart is going to continue on in a similar vein. I do like what he says here, though, that a chosen son is also a son with a task. Yahweh's son will build a house for his father. And again, note the similar terminology, language, almost a pun. That is what sons do. Indeed, that is what sons are. I wanted to pick up on this because he hits this point, which we talked about in the genealogies video, that a man is a father only if he has children. So his sons and daughters are the house builders for the father. Sons can, of course, make a muck of it. A foolish son destroys his father's house, or legacy, wealth, reputation. But a wise son builds and is a house for his father. We are back to the genealogy with its list of heads of fathers. And I had here a footnote, or I noted here in this language, that sonship is throughout the passage. And Lightheart notes here that Ben, that is son, is used 17 times in chapters 28 and 29. And 17, he notes, is the Gematria for kavod, glory. The word appears 7 times in David's opening speech alone. And again, I should also note, as I know Lightheart knows this as well, but 17 also, I was having a discussion with somebody. So the divine name number, as well as the term glory, can either be 17 or 26, both of them. The divine name is usually more so 26. However, 17 is possible in 2 ways. One is a hypothetical form where you replace the yod with an aleph. The other is the method of Gematria you use. And so one form of that does give you 17. The point here is that this term, son, is used 17 times. Again, the numerical value of either glory or the divine name Yahweh. Really interesting. And moving on, in verse 6, you have the language, he said to me, and Labuschagne notes that the divine promise, that it's 17 words. So Solomon shall build Yahweh's temple. That whole promise is 17 words. And further down in verse 15, the particulars about the golden lampstand and the lamps is also 17 words. Again, we just discussed the 17, the significance of that number. In verse 7, the language of his kingdom, Hahn writes in page 76 of his commentary that Solomon points out that the chronicler deploys this concept, kingdom, always in relation to the Davidic kingdom and almost always at critical junctures in his narrative. God turned the kingdom over to David in deposing Saul in chapter 10. David's celebration of the ark's return includes the prayerful exclamation, "The Lord reigns." The promise of the kingdom is central to the covenant with David and the temple. The kingdom is the reason for the promise to David and his descendants. And picking up on verse 8, in the sight of all of Israel, we've actually covered a lot of this ground, but I do want to read this portion because it hits on something, a note I made earlier, that the chronicler seems to be drawing this parallel because he sees a final typological correspondence between the careers of David and Moses. Each was disqualified by sin from completing the task for which God raised him up, and the task of each was completed by divinely appointed successors. God did not permit Moses to enter the promised land because of his failure of leadership at Meribah in the wilderness. The precise sin of Moses is the subject of centuries of debate in rabbinic literature. Possibly the chronicler detected some similarity between Moses' lack of trust in God's promises and the lack of trust shown by David in ordering his military census. And moving on to David's charge of Solomon, Lightheart notes in his commentary a rough chiasm stretching from verse 11 to 18, and it centers on the lampstands and lamps and the tables in the center. But either way, you have this Tabnit language serving as something of an inclusio to the section. So moving on in verse 11, this language of the plan of the vestibule, Lightheart has some interesting observations. So he's talking about this Tabnit idea and the rough floor plan, so on and so forth. He says the plan also includes instructions for organizing the priests and Levites in verse 13, and for the utensils of service for the temple. In Exodus, Tabnit is directly applied only to the tabernacle and its furnishings, specifically the lampstand. In Chronicles, priests and Levites are more explicitly included as part of the design, the living furniture in Yahweh's house. We are moving toward the new covenant in which the temple and its furnishings are entirely humanized. The latter includes designs for lampstands and lamps, tables, forks, basins, and pitchers, the altar of incense, and the cherubic chariot, which itself is the only reference we have. This is a pretty unique reference, right, to the Merkavah, right, to the throne chariot. And moving on, I want to do more on the Tabnit stuff, but for the sake of time, I don't think I am. That could be its own video, but I will observe here with this dissertation from Ming Him Ko that the tabernacle, you have basically three Tabnit plans. You have the one in Exodus, you have Solomon's temple here, and you have Ezekiel's visionary temple, kind of that temple of the future idea. And he also notes that in the Exodus account as well, that Tabnit acts as an inclusio. Moving on, continuing in verse 11, it refers to the room for the mercy seat. Again, we already discussed mercy seat ideas, but Johnstone says the temple proper, but more probably just the Holy of Holies, is called the house of the covering. That is the covering or the lid of the ark mentioned only here in Chronicles. Moving on to verse 12, the language of the plan of all that he had in mind, because there's a reference there to spirit, essentially, or to Ruah. And there's debate over who exactly are we talking about? Who's the reference to? And Myers takes it to the Spirit of God. He says the usual rendering, everything that came into his mind. And that would assume David is the referent here. But he says it's not adequate here since the term for spirit, Ruah, is not used of man, but always of God by the chronicler. And Lightheart likewise continues on. Unlike Moses, David does not have to climb a mountain to get the Tabnit, or the pattern, or whatever. It comes from the Spirit with him, and from a writing from the Lord that comes by his hand upon me, in verse 19. The Ruah is Yahweh's, and he stirs David to produce a written plan. David's Tabnit comes from Yahweh as much as Moses does, but David is a more active agent. He does not simply see a pattern and replicate it. The pattern comes from within him, and he writes it, though only because Yahweh's hand is on him. David thus makes a step forward in the progress of human creativity. The first creation was by Yahweh's unmediated word. The second creation came through Moses' conformity to the tabnet he saw on the mountain. The tabnet for the new creation of the temple is imprinted in David's heart, written and then passed to Solomon. Yahweh's spirit hovered over creation to give it form and fullness. Now Yahweh's spirit hovers over David so he can form and fill a new word. As poetic as that section by Lightheart is, I do believe it's packed with really good theology, because there is certainly a sense in how the temple, and I would say the tabernacle that preceded it, there's this microcosm, macrocosm relationship with earth, with creation. We'll hit this when we actually hit the temple. I'll try to go through a lot of material by other people like G.K. Bill, who've written a lot about this idea. So there really is a sense in when Moses is building the tabernacle and when later David is giving this floor plan, this tabnet, this pattern for the temple, that it is a recreation. It's a creation of the world and frankly, the universe, because that's how it was seen. And I think that that's why you have some of this messianic language about the falling away of creation, stars falling from the sky and things like that. And you can look at it and say, well, that didn't happen when Jesus came and was crucified and things like that. But it's like, no, but you did have the temple veil torn. You did have the temple destroyed in 70 AD, which to an Israelite in that time would have been like the model, and not just a metaphorical model, but in many ways, the literal portal between earth and heaven was destroyed. So in a way, the entire universe was undone, uncreated in 70 AD, for example. And so it does make sense what Lightheart is getting at. I do want to hit this by Johnstone in verse 12. You have the language of the treasuries of the house and so on and so forth. Johnstone says, again, the reminder is given that the temple also contains the storehouses of the holy things. That's the way he translates it. And these offerings in kind dedicated by the people, which are the symbols of the dedication of their whole lives. Compare that to 1 Chronicles 23:28. But I want to read this because he goes through what these things were for. So he says the use of the forks is indicated by the narrative in 1 Samuel 2:13 and 14. By them, the offerings due to the priest were removed from the boiling sacrifices. The basins were the means whereby the sacrificial blood was collected and dashed against the altar of burnt offering. See the use of the associated verb in connection with the burnt offering in, for example, Leviticus 1:5. The communion sacrifice in, for example, Leviticus 3:2, and above all, the guilt offering in Leviticus 7:2. The cups were used in connection with the libations of wine associated with the showbread, and no doubt the daily sacrifices at the altar of burnt offerings. The role of the incense altar is indicated in Exodus 37 and 8, to wreathe the nave with smoke night and morning when Aaron trimmed the lamps, and in Leviticus 16:12 in rites of atonement. Compare Leviticus 4:7 in connection with the sin offering. The violation of its sanctity is going to be precisely the occasion of Hezekiah's Ma'al in 2 Chronicles 26:16. And I can't help but note here, so many of these things, you have the cups, like libations and things like that, incense. So much of this language is picked up in Revelation. The bowls of judgment, things like that. These are all sacrificial. It's sacrificial language. Trumpets. These are all things that were deeply associated with liturgy and in the temple. In verse 18, Merrill and other commentators pick up on the language here of the golden chariot, the throne chariot, the Merkavah. He says the grammatical structure of verse 18 suggests that chariot is another term for cherubim. The latter, plural, were angelic beings whose purpose was to overshadow the ark in such a way as to both shield it from profaneness and to prevent God's glory from overwhelming any mortal close to it. I pointed out to say that this is actually a very unique usage where it kind of explicitly makes that connection with the cherubim, with the chariot. In verse 19, concerning the language, all this he made clear to me in writing from the hand of the Lord. Merrill, page 300 of his commentary, says, The most important points to be observed in the following instructions about the temple building are: 1. The planning to the least detail was not to be attributed to David's creativity or giftedness, but to the revelation God had imparted to him by the Spirit. And 2. The architectural features of the building were not designed necessarily for functional purposes. Rather, there is symbolism at each stage. 3. The precision in the selection of the metals and the instruments for which they were designated also is symbolic. But beyond that is the meticulous care that the artisans must take in weights and measures. The point to be made is that there is no room for expediency or imprecision in the worship of Yahweh, and in the places and appurtenances he designates for that to be done. And I did want to pick up on the footnote that he had. He says, the Hebrew is somewhat truncated here, all that was by the Spirit with him. However, it is clear that David claims revelation from outside himself, that is, from God. This remarkable statement, if not establishing beyond doubt the divine nature and even personhood of God's Spirit, at least prepares the way for a later recognition of this truth in the New Testament and even close to it in Jewish tradition. And he lists here a number of references. But continuing on with Merrill, now concerning the language of in writing from the hand of Yahweh upon me, he says it is susceptible to at least two principal interpretations. One, God had actually written the text, as appears to be the case with the rewritten Decalogue in Exodus. Or 2, David wrote it at Yahweh's virtual dictation. He compares that to Jeremiah. The preposition is in large sense determinative, of which is preferable. The normal gloss of the form would be upon me, but the meaning about or concerning is also attested, thus writing concerning me. That's what a lot of commentators or translations actually will do that quite a bit. However, the nearest referent hand suggests that upon is the better option. So in other words, is it concerning him or is it upon him? If it's concerning, it kind of becomes more of a reference to David directly. Whereas if it's upon, if the hand is upon, then it becomes more so God being, the mediator, if you will, which makes more sense of the passage, I think. And Johnstone picks up on, this idea as well. He says, the authority of David's blueprint for all Israel's cultic institutions is reinforced by the final verse of this section. In verse 19, everything was by writing by the hand of the Lord. The phrase picks up the reference to inspiration in verse 12. And he says, compare that to Ezekiel 1 through 3, which itself is really interesting because you really have some kind of Trinitarian-esque things going on where you have different things going on. You have the being, the man enthroned, and then you have the spirit interacting as well. You have a lot of stuff going on there. But he says, it is followed by a curious interjection in the first person. He imparted understanding to me. And he says, compare this to 1 Chronicles 23:5. I want to return to that. But he imparted understanding to me in order to emphasize that the surpassing authority of the divine revelation of the temple and its cult to David. Okay, so what's interesting about that is we didn't talk about 1 Chronicles 23:5 because we dealt with that entire section in a chunk. I'll read it from verse 4. It says, 24,000 of these, David said, shall have charge of the work in the house of the Lord. 6,000 shall be officers and judges, 4,000 gatekeepers, and 4,000 shall offer praises to the Lord with the instruments that I have made for praise. Now, the controversy or the issue here in this section is that first person reference that I have made for praise, it's difficult. Japhet says of this language that it raises a textual difficulty. In the Hebrew, all the preceding verbs are in the third person, and there is no indication of transition to a first-person speaker. The LXX, in fact, renders this verb too in the third person, perhaps reflecting a Hebrew variant reading. Personally, I think that the LXX person just split the difference. They didn't know what to do with that. Some commentators resolve the difficulty by introducing David said in verse 4 and 5. And also the RSV as well as the ESV here, the NEB follows the LXX. So many translations will put this in, that David said. But if you go to the text and even read a footnote, it'll often point this out. There is no Hebrew there for that language. That's added by English for the purpose of clarification. Now, that's really interesting, though, because it would seem to indicate that David created the instruments for worship. Or are we supposed to take that reference to God? But I think the reference is actually to David. In Kleineg's book that we dealt with in the last section, in page 78, he says, just as David had instituted the words, place, and times for the choral performance, so he is said to have made the musical instruments for praise. So there he's assuming that that's how to translate this. And he continues that they are therefore called the instruments of David in 2 Chronicles 29:26 and verse 27. So you have that language of instruments of David. The Levites stood with the instruments of David and the priests with the trumpets. But even 2 Chronicles 7:6 says, the priests stood at their posts, the Levites also, with the instruments for music to the Lord that King David had made for giving thanks to the Lord. So I don't know why it's so controversial to some people that we should enter in David into that phrase, even though it doesn't actually say that. It makes sense given what you have elsewhere, that David did, in fact, build and make these instruments for worship. But going with what Johnstone is noting in this particular section, it's very perceptive of him to note this. In fact, I think he's the only commentator that makes this connection where it seems to loop back to chapter 23, verse 5, where here, it has that weird jump between, first, third person kind of thing, but he seems to loop this back into 1 Chronicles 23, where the instruments are attributed to David. But we will finish off with verse 20 with Johnstone in page 283 of his commentary. He writes, David now bases his command on an assurance of assistance, both divine and human. He uses the relatively infrequent combination, the Lord God, Yahweh Elohim, to provide the maximum theological impact. The intimacy of the proper name of Israel's God, the Lord, Yahweh, coupled with the objectivity of the cosmic term for deity, God, Elohim. And of course, compare this to 1 Chronicles 17, 16, and 17, you get that rare usage again, which itself takes you back to the Garden of Eden, creation, stuff like that. But even the intimacy has a note of objectivity within it for Solomon. He only knows this God as the God of his father. It is only by virtue of the pioneering role of David that Solomon is entering upon such a heritage and responsibility. David emphasizes the point in the next phrase, my God is with you, using again the preposition with of the messianic name Emmanuel, and compare that to 1 Chronicles 11:9. I thought that was an interesting way to close out the Emmanuel promise. And again, we've hit a number of times New Testament themes that, again, get into the incarnation. I think especially when you're dealing with things that go back to the covenants with David, how well that ties to ideas of the incarnation, of God becoming man, dwelling with humanity. Emmanuel, God with us, and it's quite the promise. But that is chapter 28, and we will close out 1 Chronicles next time. So I will see you then.